Hello everyone, it's Elle. Welcome to another episode of Gender in Focus. Today we are back to talking about one of the most popular topics when it comes to creating trans and non-binary inclusive workplaces, and that is washrooms. There are so many different ways that organizations can make washrooms and other shared spaces inclusive. And today we're focusing on one of the more structural aspects, specifically around things to consider when wanting to combine two previously gendered washrooms together to create one big all-gender washroom. So I'm here with the washroom king, Kai Scott.
Oh,
hello.
Hi. Wow. That's a crown I may not take on. I'm happy to support, but it was just like this toilet crown too. Just
That's what I'm imagining. People do go to you for that though. It's a big one on social media. People are looking for washroom daddy.
Washroom magic. Oh dear. Yes, indeed.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah. How about yourself?
I'm so good, thank you. If you can hear a sort of gentle rumbling in the background, hopefully you can't. It is both of my dogs are snoring in tandem at the moment.
Wow.
Can you hear it, or is it?
No, maybe lightly, but no, that's magical though, and very sweet to
Very
have.
cute.
Just restful pups at your feet.
I always sort of thought that having tired out dogs would be the best, like the most productive for getting work done. But it turns out that they're so cute that I can't stop staring at them, and like absolutely no work gets done. So it's pretty hard.
I can understand. That makes a lot of sense.
So let's get into washrooms. When organizations come to Transfocus, a lot of the time they're kind of coming from a place where their workplace is already set up, their building is already built, and everything is already as it is without trans and non-binary people really being considered. It just wasn't on people's radar before. And so when it comes to something like washrooms, where men's washrooms and women's washrooms are kind of already in place, and organizations are sort of sat there thinking, okay, how do we make this work to be more inclusive? What are the things that people kind of need to consider when it comes to renovations or all those aspects?
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point you're making, because, there's so many different ways of approaching this, different situations that organizations are, within, so to speak. And certain organizations have the good fortune of being able to design their own building, which is a really great place to be. You have so much more control over what you're able to put into place, be more thoughtful, do consultation, and all of this comes together along with, considerations of budget and space and whatnot. But it's just so much easier, I would say, if you have your own building and you're designing it yourself, versus the situation we're talking about here today, which is renovations of existing buildings. So, like you said, the building's already in place. You have your limited footprint. That is a real constraint. Also, there's considerations around, where the water is in terms of piping. And
Right.
it just like, I don't envy people and organizations that are in this position, because there's so much to balance, right? It's just a part of the equation. There's also a lot of different options based on the types of washrooms you have within the building. You were mentioning men's and women's. That's often the case, that a lot of clients come into us and say, we have men's and women's. We get that that's not enough, right? That does not fulfill the needs of the full gender spectrum. What do we do? That's the big, heartfelt question with lots of anxiety because they're wanting to renovate. They don't know how to renovate, and they don't know what the options available are. They just know they have a gap.
So when people recognize that they have this gap and they can see that it's not in place and what they need doesn't quite work for the people that are working for them, what are the things, what's kind of the place to start when it's looking at what we need to consider?
Absolutely. So we do tend to start with an inventory. Obviously, if you're a small organization with one office, it's pretty quick, like we
Right.
have
Yeah, yeah.
men's and women's. There's 5 stalls in the women's, there's 3 stalls and 2 urinals in the men's. Just having a basic sense of what you have is really important, because then it allows you to come up with, okay, what do we do next?
Mm.
What are some of the things that we can put in place? Another thing to note is whether the washrooms are co-located, so somewhere next to each other, right? Some
Mm.
men's and women's washrooms are. Others are like many meters away from each other. They don't share anything really, including they don't share a wall, right? And that's a
Mhm.
different situation, which we won't go into today. There are options available for that situation, but it's a little bit more involved. So, what we're talking about here today is if the men's and women's washrooms are co located. And so,
Mhm.
we'll dive into what the options are if there's a shared wall that could be worked with. Um, Oftentimes, what organizations do when they have two co located men's and women's washrooms is they're like, oh, we'll just put a sign on them and then to say they're all gender, and that's the end of the story.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm. That's
And
funny. So they're kind
yeah,
of like not quite realizing that they're with different there's like a different need, there's it's set up in a different way, and so you can't, what's the problem then with that? You
mm,
can't just chuck a sign on and go, it's okay, all gender, off you go.
I mean, I would love for that to be so easy, right? I mean, we're constantly looking for easy solutions to things. But what we find is that when you bring more than one gender together, you're having to now think about privacy, additional privacy needs, especially the way that men's and women's are typically structured. They tend
Mm,
to have gaps in the stalls. I'm sure your favorite,
right.
right? Everyone's
Oh my
favorite.
god, stresses me out so much. That is like the hardest out of everything. Moving to
Yeah.
Canada, why are those
Mm,
gaps there? The amount of eye contact I have made with people mid pee, like we don't need that. What's happening?
no, that's so true. Through the cracks when they have a mirror, and you're like, ooh,
Oh
even if they're
my
passing
gosh.
by, it's like bananas. So this is where it doesn't even work in the when you have a single gender or
Right.
singles designated. um it it just even there it's not great, like you were describing and I've experienced.
Hmm.
And so you bringing more genders together requires more privacy. We can't have that going on,
No.
because that makes people all very uncomfortable. Um, and so there are additional renovations needed to establish greater privacy within an all gender space. I
Mm.
would say additionally, it is also really important to ensure that there are, sight lines for safety within that. And so it might not just work with the current configuration. Sometimes there's like blind corners or anything
Right.
that, or darker lighting. It's just, you really need to think about it from a few different lenses to be able to make something comfortable and usable for everyone. One other thing I wanted to note is that um, what can happen, even if you introduce privacy and safety features um, and just keep the washroom separated, people tend to use the washroom like they have before. And
Right.
then you have this like historical use pattern where men are going to go in this place and women are going to go in that place. And
Right. So
it
even if it's labeled as all gender, it's not all gender.
exactly because of the way people look or the way they are in these spaces. And so actually just reproduces men's and women's, but has a different label, maybe a little
Mm.
additional privacy. So that's where, depending on people's budgets, right? I appreciate that
Hmm.
this is more costly, is actually removing the wall between men's and women's washrooms, um, such that It's a larger all-gender multi-stall in ways that don't reproduce the patterns, allow for that greater privacy, allow for flow-through because now you have two entrances rather than one, and that creates a greater sense of ease and the ability to leave a space if one wanted without, safety considerations. So those are some of the benefits of that, removing the shared wall between men's and women's and making it a bigger all gender washroom stall or washroom.
What, presumably, and this is a huge assumption here, I wouldn't know, but I'm guessing that some organizations have a little bit of hesitancy when you come and suggest, like, let's lop a wall off. So what are the things that organizations come to you with when it comes to that hesitancy? Like, what things are they asking you?
Yes. So you're right that there's kind of mechanical and plumbing and architectural considerations. It's not simply we can remove any wall between washrooms. Right. We want the building still to stand afterwards. And I will say I'm not an architect, so this is more me from what I've heard. So it's always good to connect with an architect to help with this. And we do usually work with architects to help both on this kind of cultural social piece as well as the architectural mechanical pieces. But if a wall between men's and women's has piping in it, or if it's called a load-bearing wall, so that means it's integral to the structure of the building. So if you remove it, the building is falling.
There's some problems,
So,
yeah.
yeah, we can do that's a non-starter if that's the case. But if those things aren't at play or any other complicating factors, then it is a good candidate for removal and creating this more inclusive space that doesn't kind of repeat patterns of use between them. But those are some of the considerations, like around plumbing, especially load bearing. So that's a good thing to ask as part of working with an architect.
So you did already go through this when you were talking about why you can't just put a sign, change the signs and leave it as it is. But I was hoping you could go into it in a little more detail with regards to what that then looks like once you have, you've removed this wall and you've created this bigger space. Just having a bigger space with two doors, again, isn't enough. So what does that look like? And we can link, you've got like a really great example of this on our YouTube account that I can link in the show notes. But I was wondering if you could do a sort of mini walkthrough of what you might see in a space like that once it's been renovated to meet those needs.
Yeah, it's such a material significant difference between what we traditionally experience as washrooms. And I like that you suggest, like you're mentioning, I did a walkthrough of Clayton Community Center in Surrey, British Columbia. It was designed by HCMA Architecture. They do really excellent work, and we're frequently collaborating with them because of the great work that they do. And essentially, they have kind of an open entrance. There is a pillar in the middle, but essentially, it's kind of allows for that active monitoring from the outside of the washroom into the inside and vice versa, right? So there's kind of a constant connection between people, which helps with active monitoring and safety, whether it's staff monitoring or other fellow facility users. So that's really helpful. It's usually really well lit in a way that there's kind of nothing that, can get in the way of safe navigation of that space, whether that's for somebody, who's in a mobility device, right? Or a family, like just any type of person really appreciates that type of lighting. There's also at the level of the stall door, I wouldn't even really call them stalls, to be honest. They're almost their own rooms because they're fully self-contained, floor to ceiling, no gaps at all. Like you essentially close the door and it's your room with its own lighting and there's usually a safety button there in case there's need to call for help. It's well insulated in terms of sound. I know that can be a consideration for a lot of folks who want to have sound privacy for obvious
Fair enough.
reasons. So all of these things are make it really effective for people to be comfortable to adapt. And if, in fact, we've done some patron consultation where we just ask people about their experiences of a particular all gender multi stall washroom. And at first they're hesitant and nervous.
Mm.
And once they experience it, they're like, wow, that was, one person said, that was so posh. And I thought that was so sweet. You know, it's just like, wow. You know, they felt like they were at Holt Renfrew. And I was like, yes. Luxury bathroom.
That's so interesting though, because that's the thing is when we talk about all gender washrooms, there is so much hesitancy around it that there's like people are very unsure, very uncomfortable with the idea of that kind of change from what we're used to, or they're very hesitant around like what that might look like in terms of safety or comfort or discomfort. And what we've found is that people really like them
Yeah.
once they're
Yeah,
there.
absolutely. And I think people are a bit surprised by that realization of initial
Mm-hmm.
hesitancy and then really enjoying it,
Mm-hmm.
because of
Right.
all the thoughtful features that have been introduced. The light, the you're able to flow through the space. It's a aesthetically pleasing as well,
Mm-hmm.
and the privacy. And then the one last thing I'll mention is that the locks are color coded, so it's really obvious. Okay, this one's occupied. Go to the next one. This one is
Mm-hmm.
available, right? Whether HCMA likes to put in light, so it lights up above the door, and so it's
Mm.
really obvious, which I like. But just
Mm-hmm.
the door locks are fine too, right? So yeah,
Right.
those are some of the features.
That's really cool. One of the things that you've mentioned to me before is that sometimes organizations will want to change one washroom into an all
Mm.
gender space and then leave the other one. So usually they might turn the men's washroom into an all gender washroom and then leave the women's washroom just as a women's washroom. And so I wanted you to go into that and why that happens, first of all.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's so many different, what I would call kind of creative solutions. And I appreciate people are trying to figure out a difficult thing. So I
Yeah.
always encourage creativity. However, the the reality of the tensions that already exist between men and women, we're not even talking about trans people, um, don't lend themselves well to doing an imbalanced approach, right?
Mm.
And so sometimes people do that because they're like, oh, we need to keep women's spaces, which I understand. I'm not discounting that
Right.
approach. But unfortunately, it can then inadvertently create an animosity or a hostility,
Mm-hmm.
of like, or resentment that men experience because now they no longer have a gender specific one, but the women do. And so
Mm.
it creates these dynamics that are unfortunate and, for me, unnecessary, especially if they're creating, removing the wall if it's possible, or just even working within the two separate spaces equally, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's done where from floor to floor it changes, right? So on one floor it might be women's, on the next floor it's the men's, and you know, kind of trying to get into that, but then it's really difficult to kind of keep track of
Yeah.
which floor is what. And I don't think it lends itself to easy access. And so that's where we we're okay with, and we're fine with certain number of washrooms remaining men's and women's, especially if there's so many washrooms in a building, different floors and whatnot. But just keeping it consistent so that it's easy to navigate, whether somebody doesn't want that and they need to go to another floor or vice versa, right? So just don't I strongly discourage changing just one facility, whether it's keeping the women's or keeping the men's. I've seen both versions, and I've already seen the results are not great,
Right.
and
Right.
the organizational leaders are left holding the bag
Right.
there, and it's not fun to navigate.
I can imagine. That's
Mhm.
really interesting. That's I don't know why that surprises me
Mm,
somewhat that people would feel so particular about
mhm.
like, hey, they get their own washroom, why don't we get one?
Yeah,
Like
can get a bit
jealous.
petty.
Yeah.
But that's because there's already a basis for beef that exists between men and women
The
already.
basis for beef.
And then we're putting
Right.
one other thing on top of that, and sometimes
Mm,
that's the straw that breaks the camel's back, and it's not fun. So,
no.
you know, we see all kinds of gendered dynamics, not necessarily related to trans and non-binary issues, but because we're changing something that involves gender, that can
Hmm.
bring up these things that, if avoidable, we strongly recommend a different approach,
Right.
so that we're not causing this unnecessary to is unnecessary issues to an already fraught
Mm,
dynamic.
right. Yeah. Well, that sort of leads me to ask then that what do organizations need to think about beyond just the physical structural space when it
Mm,
comes to making these changes around washrooms?
yeah. So oftentimes clients come to us and are like, what can we do? How should we do it? And they're very focused on the structural changes, which is understandable. It's a big ticket price usually, and want to do it carefully, but then
Hmm.
don't quite think about how they're going to introduce that to the employees or
Right.
patrons, whoever's using the washrooms, like,
Hmm.
and especially shifting from gender specific to all gender, there's a lot of really important communications or even information sessions that can just smooth the pathway and
Hmm.
help people who perhaps are a little bit anxious or nervous about something new. Doesn't, right? This topic is all gender and multi stall, but really any change, people can become skittish. And
Hmm.
so we strongly recommend to have some thought to communications, letting people know multiple check points along the way. We're
Hmm.
starting, we're making plans, we're starting construction, it'll become
Right.
online here. There's logistics to work out. But we find that we've conducted these is information sessions for facility users really helps them ask the questions that are foremost on their mind,
Mm.
gives them a sense of what is actually going to be the case and what's not, right? So there's a lot of myth busting that comes with um, uh, all gender multi-stall. It's not as safe. It's unhygienic. There are a few other things we can link to other episodes we've recorded on these topics. So just giving people an opportunity to kind of think it through and maybe even have a organized tour of the new facility to give people,
Mm.
hey, here are the safety and privacy features. This is how it looks and feels like before it comes online, and that gives people just a way to bring down some of the temperature that can often accompany all gender multi-stall.
Would it be okay if you go into those information sessions a little bit more, like what that
Mm,
actually looks like and what you've seen other organizations do or how you've worked with other organizations to really give people the information that they're worried about? Because you're right, like
mm,
the topics that we've talked about on the podcast are all topics that have come up. Like that's why we're talking about them. It's because people have the concerns. And
uh-huh.
so like what do the information sessions look like where people can voice those?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're really helpful, and some, like, we've led a lot of them where we basically go through what are the changes that are coming, what's the timeline. Often these are kind of the key questions that people have. What's happening, when is it happening, and
Hmm.
why. The why is super important. I think people, especially leaders, kind of skip over that part. That we're like, well, because we need to, or we have to, or whatever, right? They just kind of steamrolling
Did you
ahead.
ever, as a kid, ever get told like because I said so? That was my mum's top phrase. You just like, I feel like some trauma has just been revisited then.
Pretty much. I can
So
totally relate to that. Yeah.
organizations will go, we're doing it because that's what we said.
Yes.
So
Yes.
like, without going into the detail.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Mum, if you're listening, calling you out on a podcast.
And like so many other parents and organizations can get into that mode. And unfortunately, it does not work, especially on a change that is so currently fraught. Like it's like a bit of in a political hot spot because of all kinds of things. So it's still important and still possible to go forward in a good way. It's just setting it up in a thoughtful way, the information session in terms of what, when, and why. Why is a really important one to go into. Oftentimes, clients want us to focus only on trans and non binary folks, but we actually discourage that because we're obviously not the main benefactors or the only benefactors. So it's good to spell out, other people. I mean, really everyone, but in particular, people with disability or mobility devices. We have families that are coming together. There's, people with care aides of different genders, right, than themselves. On and on and on, right? So I think that full list is really important to spell that out and not to isolate one benefactor above another. So that's where we go into those explanations. And then tying it to organizational values. We say we're inclusive, but what does that mean tangibly on the ground every day? Here's one example of that. And, we saw a gap, it needs to be filled. And it's not to say that you don't talk about trans and non-binary folks, but we're just one of many that are benefiting from this. Yeah. And you can even go into the specifics of like trans and non-binary folks often get stares, comments, questions, pushback to them being in gender specific spaces in ways that make them really gravitate towards all gender spaces where there's no expectations. Everyone's welcome, right? So I think spelling that out is key.
So if an organization is at the very beginning of this conversation and they're thinking about initial steps, and I appreciate that you've already mentioned this, but what does that look like? Like, what's the very first thing that they should do aside from obviously calling Transfocus?
Yes, that is a smart first move.
Yeah, but like, what's they're thinking, okay, this is something we want to do. What's the first thing that they should be looking at and considering?
Yeah. And we can link this in the show notes because this is a widely available tool that we offer, is to conduct a washroom inventory. Or if you have change rooms, that's all can also be in the mix. And we do it in such a way as you're counting the number of fixtures, not the number of washrooms. What do I mean by fixture? It's a washroom unit a toilet or a urinal. Those are fixtures, or a shower if it's a change room. So, and then you get a ratio between the number of gender specific, men's and women's, and all gender. And if your ratio is below 25%, you're falling behind most organizations that we've worked with, right? And so you want to figure out how to up that. And some organizations already know that they have 0% all gender, which is a huge gap and barrier to non-binary as well as trans men and women who don't want to deal with gender specific spaces for reasons of harassment. So yeah, once you have a sense of that percentage or that ratio, then, and you also have an inventory of the units, you can start to say, okay, what if we did this to these two washrooms, how would that change the numbers? So you can kind of play around before making any decisions to see what impact that has. Does it increase it by 5%, 10%? And sometimes organizations want to go right away to 100% all gender, and it depends on the size of the org. If you're smaller, that might just have to be the case. But for larger organizations with a lot of washrooms, we actually discourage going 100% right away because that can create a really difficult dynamic and even a backlash against trans and non-binary folks who are seen as the main reason for these types of spaces, even though they're not. There are many benefactors. So it's just, being thoughtful about the process. All of this we explore in strategy sessions with organizations so that in kind of a low pressure, understanding the pros and cons, you can then figure out what's best for the organization.
And if an organization wanted to go through one of those strategy sessions with you, where can they do that?
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes to our strategy session and just provides a brief description. We do that on washrooms, policy, information systems. So a few key categories where generally there's some tough trade-offs, right? And so just wanting somebody who's done that with other organizations to be able to help lead through a process that allows for that informed decision-making, to be fully aware of, what you're getting and what perhaps you're not getting, right? And being thoughtful in that process. So yeah, we'll definitely share a bit more information on our website.
Sweet. Okay, I will link that into the show notes. Is there anything else that you would want to talk about before we go?
No, that about covered this one way of renovating. There are other ways to renovate, different options, but this one's a particular one that I don't hear talked about a lot. So I'm glad we got the opportunity to kind of deep dive on that, and then also talk a little bit more about all gender multi-stall washrooms and some of the positive momentum towards them. So yeah, thank you.
Amazing. Well, goodbye. See you next week. Goodbye from me and the Washroom King. And we'll see you next week.
Bye for now.